book on the Mexican crisis in 1982. It still makes great reading. But beyond that, well, a few papers, you have chapters here and there. But if you look at young people below 50, well, essentially they don't know anything about it. So what this book does is yes. What this book started from, it started with a discussion with Jacques de la Rivière, who was a great managing director between 78 and 87, who actually managed hands-on the crisis in the first year together with his good friend Walker. And we got a discussion, and from there started the project of a book of testimonies with he and his great friend, Paul Walker, Dr. Guillermo Ortiz, and Julia from the Mexican side, Bigot, who was the chief coordinator on the bank side, the so-called Club, and Charles Varela was the main frontman on the US Treasury side, and one of the architects of the crisis. So we started this way, and I must admit that we did not have a lot of foresight. But after a few months, I discovered, well, when you have been talking to this guy, you can talk to about anybody else. And when you've done that, you say, maybe I should look at the archives in some more details. And indeed, lots of them have not been looked. Here we go. No, most of what's good. Here we are. So I looked at the IMF archives, which, as we just were saying, you are just great, especially the minutes of the board, which at that time were supposed to never, ever be public. So people say very frankly what they think about this and that entry, what they think of the managing director, and so on. So it makes good reading. But then you have the BIS, or the kind of reflection, or you rather find the papers in the archive of central banks, the New York Fed, Bank of England, and the UK Treasury were very active, much, but suddenly the one European country much more decisively engaged, at least in the early years. And then North Bank, the Lydia, that kind of thing. So where I started from. Corollary, it's a very top-down view. I think went down in the archives of Mexico or Argentina, we would not have some kind of survey of this and that, difficult negotiation between the Brazilians and the fund and so on. Boston has a lot of it. So it's very top-down, and it's also very Western-centric as a corollary. So there is room for more work. And now if you want to have the typical word you will find on the crisis is the notion of a lost decade, which I did not use. Then here you can see if it's clear enough on the slide that indeed you see growth collapsing. Latin America at the time when the rest of the world was doing rather well, especially East Asia. And if you truly want to have an index for the last decade, you see that GDP per capita on average has been decreasing year after year. But then, as interesting is the divergence between Latin America and, well, maybe you can take command of, because I've got, so you can move to the next slide. So here you have, the graph. Here. So here you have the GDP per capita as a percentage of US GDP per capita the same year. So it's a rough measure of convergence, divergence. And what you see is that Latin America indeed diverged quite sharply at the time when East Asia was catching up. 1982 in Latin America, the GDP per head twice as high as East Asia. So it's a kind of different world than the one we know today. Next slide. And so what went structure is, these were syndicated loans. It was bank-based and not bond-based. And the vehicle was syndicated loan, which is important because a syndicated loan is launched by typically 4 or 5 big banks and then sliced and resold to typically tens of smaller banks. Well, the problem here is who is launching? And those who launched had pretty little responsibility and due diligence. There was no gatekeeper. Nobody truly looked at the details of what's going on in Brazil or in Mexico and so on. And the banks themselves had no responsibility here. You look very clearly in the contract, they say, never ever go into a negotiation on payments. We can sue you if you go and then come back to us and say, please accept this and that type of a haircut. On the other hand, you got nothing else. Contractual clauses, international private-public law, market customs, nothing. Just bits of rules here and there, but certainly not a kind of emerging regime. And moreover, the lessons from the 1930s were lost. I've been asking Jacques de la Rosière, did you look at it sometime during the weekend at No. And did you ask to your chief lawyer, Joseph Gold, about advice? I'm saying, not so much. So this was very practical, very hands-on, with very little influence or materials drawn from past experience. And as a consequence, next, the whole regime was invented essentially from scratch. The book develops a kind of unknown story of how this regime gradually was developed by trial and errors. And the beginning was very simple. Early 1970s, you had a board discussion. Should the IMF somehow condition lending to some kind of agreement with country with problem with banks, so-called lending into arrear or not? If you lend into arrear, essentially that may say, oh, you wash your hand. The IMF does its job and the banks sort out their problem. But then the US directors say, well, maybe the fund can be useful. And then you have the whole story of the 70s, looking at specific debt problem and building a know-how, entering more and more deeply in the relationship between debtor and creditor, without any type of J7 or big discussion on the principle and so on. And so here you got something that is quite, next slide, is quite curious, is that you ended up with something with hindsight is very unique, which is the only debt restructuring in history that was entirely operated at the multilateral level. Before and after that, all debts have been renegotiated much closer to the financial place, which means London or New York, and therefore the political economy, the local regulators, and today the courts. Here you have a unique pattern. And next element, which is as important, that was entirely informal. The IMF developed that set of rules below the radar with support from the board, that means from sovereign member state, but without any type of amendment to the Articles of Agreement, any type of J7 communique, nothing. Still, it was remarkably stable. You had more than 100 restructuring, and everybody knew the rules of the game. They were essentially the same from the first to the last year. But still it was fully informal. But why, you would ask? Well, one dimension is the IMF did not have any, and still have no mandate to look at capital account operations. So you can't say it very often, even if everybody knows what he is doing. Next, please. Now you have the classic timeline, 1982-85, starting with the Mexican crisis. You have about 35 countries restructuring. Big crisis. Lots of burden on the IMF and the London clubs. And key principle, these are all liquidity events. Only liquidity problems, therefore no write-off should be discussed. And that will be kept for every country in 1989. corollary to that, as you don't write off the debt, well, you should provide support through new loans, so-called new money loans, which would become highly conflictual at that time, because banks were in fact invited to put more money on old money. Problem, it didn't work. 85, 86, country had broadly adjusted. None of them was back in the market. Nowhere did you see recovery coming on. So you got the Baker Plan, the name of by Jim Baker, which became the head of the US Treasury, which, as we know, moved from macroeconomic adjustment to structural adjustment, which soon got the name of the Washington Consensus. The beginning of the Washington Consensus, usual term is there. And again, no write-offs. And Jim Baker, if you want to have a bad guy in this history, I'm not looking specifically for bad guy, I'm not in the job of indicting people, but here you go. He was the key enforcer. No discussion on write-offs. Even though 87, 89, the Dean, the American financial elite, there was serious doubt of whether that would go on. 89, Bush administration come in, new secretary Bradley comes in, and immediately you got the budget program, launched a few weeks after the inauguration of Bush there. Two elements here. I don't know if you got it entirely. First, debts are cut by 15 to 45% on the basis of the secondary market. I'll be talking about it. And then plus some collaterals. And then the whole stock of loan exchange for bonds. So at that point, you shift entirely to the new model. Next. Here's the bad guy. Looks like one. Next. Yeah, I know he played a big role afterwards. Yeah, the photo is impressive. Yeah, you know he has power in his two hands. Pardon. So how are debt renegotiated? That was classic IMF approach. Standby with conditionality has been a well-tested approach in the 1950s. The rules of the game were very clear. The country calls for help, and IMF mission comes, negotiate an adjustment program, and in parallel, and that's quite new, also an agreement with the banks. So you had two negotiations at the same time, and where you have this multilateral dimension coming in strongly is at the end, the standby program sent to the board has a projected balance of payment, where everybody's on board. You have assumptions regarding adjustment, contribution by the IMF and the multilateral, and the result of the financial negotiation with the banks. And all members then vote on that. So you're fully at the multilateral IMF level. And the high drama moment is quite well known for those who have been looking at that, is November 1982. The program is in place, the Mexicans have agreed on that, the IMF has a program, still you miss $5 billion, which is quite a lot at that time. And Jacques de la Rosière goes to the New York Fed, invites all the merchant investment lending banks and tell them, well, I expect you to send me $5 billion by the 13th of December. And if I don't have the money, well, the whole program remains in the drawer. So now think about your de facto insolvency. American banks were essentially insolvent if all those countries defaulted. The French were not on a better situation. The others were in kind of stronger one, but still very much exposed. So here, the IMF, but also the Fed, had a strong hand, arm twisted them, and successfully so. And, but at that time, La Rosière was very much on his own. There's no guideline, no directions, no green light by the board telling, yes, Jacques, you can move on down this road and challenge the whole international banking sector. He did essentially on his own, and as he said in the interview, well, I didn't get the board on the act very quickly. So here you have the multilateral truly coming on the open space. Next slide. So, what was the problem? Informality derives from the fact that the IMF does not have a mandate to go into sovereign debt, things like that. But the main one is the one that the national domestic bankruptcy procedure solved by adjudication, which is collective action. Never forget, a bankruptcy procedure is about the control of the debtor. It's also about resolving coordination between creditors. And here you didn't have that. The IMF has no supranational authority to force dissenting bank to add money on bad money. So, so you had a considerable degree of open arm twisting, or rather underlying arm twisting. Hardly mentioned in the existing literature. Maybe one or two papers during the 80s mentioned the point. But in fact, as Volcker said in the interview, somehow the banks had to be convinced it was in their own interest to add money. Or Ted Truman, yes, we were pretty active when exercising moral suasion. Buchheit speak of syndicated extortion. So here you have a part of the story which is, I think, quite essential. Hardly came to the public. Nobody complained in the media or on podcast or anything like this. Now, I asked Bill Rhodes, head of the banks, did you keep paper from that side? And he answered me, I didn't do a lot in terms of writing. And then was Terry Checkey from the New York Fed, who was the point man from the Fed and also from the US government, conveying a message from from Uncle Sam, as Buchheit was saying. And I told him, I talked with him 2-3 hours on the phone, and he told me, yes, you know, I spent all these decades in airplanes and meeting rooms taking notes. Notes and notes and notes on all these small volumes I had in my office. And you know what, he told me? When I retired, they destroyed it. All of them. And I can't see now, please. No, I would like to have the whole thing, not to miss point. And the last point is about, next one. And the next point is about Michael Bradfield, legal counsel at the Fed in Washington. The bulldog, as Paul Volcker called him, who was the one enforcing the rules on US banks. And I politely asked the Fed if I could have access to the archive. To Freedom of Information Act, never got anything. So I don't want to look paranoid, but at least there was something here people prefer not to talk so much about. Contrary to all that, policy elites in the West were thoroughly opposed, a large part of it, which is not at all in the history, that the board applauded La Rosière after the success of the Mexican story. But the next question, should we do that again? Implicit consensus, hopefully not. And they did for 10 years. And then I will not go through, but for instance, you have an IMF official mission visiting the Bundesbank early 1983, and the Bundesbank told them, well, the IMF's new relation with bank lending has not been thoroughly thought out. So you have a kind of here considerable tension within the Western policy elite and with the financial system, which has not been much talked about. Next. Now, I will soon be done. The second debt market. The second debt market is something curious. Well, we think about 101 financial course about finance. We are told loans should remain on the bank's books till maturity. And now by 1983, 84, you saw tranches in the old syndication between being sold and bought by banks on very much case-by-case basis, with very dangerous pricing, volatile pricing, very limited transparency in this market. But then gradually smart lawyers changed the terms of the contract and the new money won, and so transaction became much more easier, much less paperwork. And as banks strengthened their capital base, they became able to take losses. So over the years, banks have been increasingly able to sell their own loan portfolio on the market. And by 86, 87, prices were posted in the press, in the Wall Street Journal, in the Financial Times. And at that time, you could have price every morning telling you, well, this and that country has a 50% or 60 or 70% discount. And of course, that created considerable tension within the whole machinery. Why a banker would put $100 extra on, say, Bolivia or Peru, if the same $100 on a mark-to-market basis becomes $50 or $30 the next morning. So at that point, you had, with the expansion of this market, increasingly pressure, and at the same time, considerable difficulties in the countries. These are the hard years. Increase inequality, no recovery, hyperinflation across Latin America, and a dead end. These constant tensions between pressure for writing off, pressure by the market signal, and US policy. I think I will cut quite shortly. Next point. That's my last slide. That essentially the Brady program was not driven, at least intellectually, by the overhang model that has been developed years before by Jeffrey Sachs or Paul Krugman, with a very macro perspective. It's essentially a mark-to-market operation. We can't have this divergence between book value for this residual stock of loans at a time when everybody's moving to mark-to-market. So it's essentially that. And you don't have any type of debt sustainability adjustment, any calculation. I didn't find anything in the IMF archives. So it was the market plus some kind of negotiation, plus collaterals. And at that point, essentially, that's at least my reading. It's an hypothesis. I'm cautious not to be too strongly there, because it's quite hard to prove the case. But I think what you see is not the outcome being driven indeed by the overemphasis. You don't see sharp fall in debt level. You don't see the expected recovery in investment, growth, and so on. What you see is liquidity flowing into the country in huge volume. And of course, in this highly constrained economy with little saving rates, with bankrupt banking sectors, limited tax capacities, limited export exposure, liquidity matters a lot. If you don't have foreign liquidity coming in very rapidly, you reach breaking points, which means printing money, defaulting, or banking crisis. And so when liquidity came in, well, they felt better. And as a result, what you see is the macro picture was much better, but did not come to a kind of new regime of growth and catch up in terms of convergence. No. Some kind of recovery and then leveling off. But the market did pretty well. Last slide, please. Here you see the Brady bonds, I mean the secondary market becoming Brady bonds, and they make great money on that. Okay. Too bad I'm done.
Okay. Good. So now we have comments by Anna Gelpern and Sean Hagan. But now I have a curiosity. How did Volcker call the chief legal counsel of the Fed?
He doesn't have a name for the bulldog.
The bulldog. Were you ever called the bulldog at the fund when you were?
Oh, many other things.
Okay.
Dog or laptop. Anyway, that was off the record. So I could not be more thrilled and grateful for the opportunity to talk about this book here. And I want to start with just the meta comment that this is the perfect DebtCon book, like the most perfect DebtCon book ever. And it is, I want to quote here, I mean, it's transdisciplinary in the best way, right? It's politics, it's history. It is unusually sophisticated on the law and the institutional element, and of course, economics and finance, right? So you know, I wish we just, this is what DebtCon is for, and methodologically as well, and theoretically, I mean, this is just crosses all kinds of boundaries. And second, it is exquisitely timed, which is another DebtCon focus, I guess, that we want to be policy relevant while being academically rigorous. And the past couple of years, we've been hearing about how, you know, this is the 1980s all over again. So what better time to have a really rich treatment of the 1980s when, you know, we're just drowning in casual 1980s comparisons, which are then turned into sort of some combination of predictive and prescriptive takeaways, right? So I think in this discussion, it would be useful for us to kind of unpack what of the 1980s history as we see it is suitable for, is replicable or kind of suitable for adaptation today, and what of it is, you know, history as good history is, not necessarily there to be instrumentalized at will. So I want to basically say two more things, just highlight a couple of themes that seemed particularly important to me, and then second, zoom in on some of the lessons that we might try to explore here. So, and I want to start with my own very limited and casual experience with the saga that Jérôme tells in the book. In, I believe it had to be 2009. It was the anniversary of the Brady speech. And I had, or maybe it was a little early, but it was one of the big anniversaries of the Brady speech. And I somehow wiggled my, you know, junior way into a gala celebrating the anniversary. And because I lacked social skills, among other things, I would just like come up to everybody who would talk to me and say, so when did you realize that it was a solvency problem? You know, like, hey, how you doing? Nice crumpets, you know. When did you realize it was a solvency problem? And to a person, everybody said, you know, that's ridiculous. We knew it from the start. We just couldn't say it. Now, this is totally, you know, retrospective hindsight bias, of course, and who knows how much of this was subliminal. But I was just, you know, as a junior person with no social skills who wiggled my way into a gala, I was really impressed by the uniformity of the answers, right? Not a single person said, gosh, you know, it took us 10 years and a lost decade to find out that it was a solvency problem and that, you know, debt reduction was in order. But be that as it may, one of the incredible strengths of the book to me is the detailed attention to bank regulation and supervision, right? You hear a lot of, you know, kind of very casual, well, was it a banking crisis, or was it a sovereign debt crisis, and was it kind of power politics that turned one into the other? And I've engaged in that every so often. But I think just the richness of the, and the granularity of the way in which you treat, Jérôme, the bank angle and the kind of experimentation and the iterations, the constant back and forth is incredibly impressive, and I really think is one of the biggest assets of the book. Of course, their liquidity and solvency also come into play in a very different way. When I teach this material, I love, you know, pulling out the tables from Bill Klein's book, where, you know, Jérôme alluded to this. If the top 17, you know, highly indebted countries, most of them in Latin America, defaulted, you know, the capital position of the US banking sector would have been like, what, negative 140, something like that, right? that was something I learned in the Asian financial crisis, that you could have deeply negative capital, but I didn't realize that banks in New York and London were at real risk of that. The other really fascinating asset of this book is just the introduction to sovereign debt as an interdisciplinary kind of practice project, right? And the way in which it incorporates the development of the literature, the seminal literature that we heard about, starting with the beautiful tribute to Daniel Cohen yesterday morning, but this incredibly rich literature that has shaped all of our thinking. And you're very kind, because you're not just talking about the economists, you're really, sort of tracing how the economists and the lawyers came to talk to each other, and how different kinds of lawyers and different kinds of economists, came to understand one another. Again, this is a very DebtCon sort of thing, the commitment to keep talking to one another until we actually get invested in understanding one another. So that, I thought, was just a beautiful, beautiful dimension of the book, and the role of the practitioners. And here I want to highlight your attention to debtor agency, I think, is really important. And, at that same gala that I sort of interloped into, Angel Gurria told his story about, making T-shirts saying "capture the discount," right? And the very real kind of pressure and decision-making choices that the borrower governments faced, I think, is you can see it. Yes, you're right. It is a very top-down and sort of very self-consciously, Northern Western framing. But I think that it is one that highlights the criticality of debtor agency and the sophisticated ways in which it can and does play out. And that, to me, again, is just a fabulous, fabulous asset. As an institutional development study, this is where I think a lot of the lessons that we could usefully mine the book for, that's a lie. And kind of the stories of experimentation, of contingency, of personalities. There's sort of, it's like the war and peace of sovereign debt, right? Is this about the great men, or is it about the masses, and how that develops? And of course, for me, kind of the role of transactional structures and, lawyers crafting their thing, juxtaposed with geopolitics, I think, is very valuable. So I want to conclude with some questions and potential lessons. I think the first area that I'm still interested in, after having, again, crashed that party, is this liquidity and solvency question. Right now, as I'm not convinced that it's I'm not convinced that this distinction is either tractable or kind of useful in most cases. I do think that, and here I'm not quite as deterministic as Lee Buchheit, right, who basically says liquidity is sort of your, it's kind of this, first through sixth stages of grief, I guess, until you get to the seventh, which is insolvency. But I do wonder how we think about it in today's world and in the kind of market structure that we have. This is a story of learning, but it seems the pace of learning seems incredibly luxurious. I'm sure it didn't seem that way to the starving people who, were the ultimate victims of the crisis. But how much can we learn from this learning experience at a time when we have no time to learn? And, if we take another 10 years, like, the world will be drowned, and, we just don't have the time. So what do we do about that? Does the diversity and fragmentation of the creditor constituency matter. And in particular, I'm very interested in hybrid creditors, right? Creditors that are partly public, partly private, right? To be sure, the banks are totally fairly described as hybrids, particularly as, commercial banks in the West. That is the way you describe them in the book. If the Fed could pick up the phone and tell them what to do, I'm not sure that it's that different from the way in which, say, Chinese banks are portrayed today, right? But yet there is a big difference in the system and in the kinds of creditors you see and the incentives. So again, is this the presence of mixed motive creditors always there, but maybe different this time? I don't know, right? How much of the 80s lesson can we take? I will leave most of the or really all of the IMF story to Sean, because it would be ridiculous for me to be wasting your time on my views on the IMF's role with Sean to my right here. But I do want to highlight a passage on page 176, which sent me to the dictionary. And I think very much holds today, which is a lot of the way in which the fund works is this interesting combination of formality and informality, right? So there are these policies with all these words and acronyms that stand for certain things, but not a lot of people know what the heck it means. And again, let me repeat that the paper that was issued in April is a very important paper, but could have been written way better. So, sorry, I'll just keep talking about that. And yes, the common framework needs a website. So those are my two beefs in life. But, so there's this passage that talks about, it's in the lending into arrears part of the book, and talks about the staff then grandly concluded that the bank's tergiversations, I think it's waffling, should not appear to prejudice the autonomy of the fund in deciding its future relations with members, nor conflict with existing executive board guidelines. So from this, I take that the fund has a certain amount of autonomy, but not all the autonomy in the world, that clearly the private creditors try to exercise some sway over the fund, and sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. And the only way you can see the output in real time is these very fascinatingly phrased papers and such. Okay, a very last point, the kind of our joint fetish of market access today, where somehow I do feel like the product of the 80s is kind of this focus on something called market access, which I think is really very much a child of the reputational theory of, sovereign debt. And that is, if you just keep paying through the pandemic, through the war, through starvation, somehow somebody, the tooth fairy at the end of it all, will give you market access, and that will mean that you succeed. I don't know. I mean, this is something that I think is worth continuing to mine as the kind of the ideological output of the 80s path, and not just the idea of market access, but the bundle of ideas and kind of normative prescriptions that it represents. And somehow the role of the regulators falls by the wayside, right, in this story. The fact that this was really about basically bank regulators, security regulators concocting a series of environments in which the banks could do what they did. The Bradys have come to stand today for lots of things to lots of people, right? End of crisis, solution to a big problem, debt reduction as distinct from debt rescheduling, and then very often just credit enhancement for the, credit enhancement period, right? I mean, when you hear some folks say Brady, it just means, please give us guarantee or collateral, have the official sector pay for it, and then we'll, capture the discount. And I think it's important to say that the Brady's did three things that I haven't seen any proposal on the table do today, which is they did facilitate an exit of a certain group of creditors. They did result in debt reduction, and they also helped seed a new money market, right? The emerging market, bond market. And, you know, for the price of those three, I might just consider credit enhancement, but I'm not sure I'm willing to bargain that down a whole huge lot. This is a fabulous book. If there's one thing I might have wanted to see a little more on is sovereign debt litigation, but really that's too much to ask for. It's a brilliant book. It's a valuable book, and I'm just very honored to participate in its glory. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Sean?
So, thank you, Jerome. This is an excellent book covering what I think is a very underserved topic. In other words, as you pointed out, it was a massive crisis, a systemic crisis, and not a lot has been written on this topic. So I think it's excellent that you've written it now. You won't be surprised to know that I kind of focused on the IMF institutional, legal, and policy dimension. I was very happy to see you talk about issues that normally do not get a lot of coverage, but I agree with you were central in the development of the technology at the IMF, including the standby arrangement, as an instrument that was non-contractual, primarily because if a country program went off track, you didn't want to say they were in violation of their international agreement. And that was a very, from a political sovereignty perspective, was critical. I also really like the fact that you highlighted the fact that the IMF has its own power of interpretation. When you're dealing in a crisis, you do not want to have a third party coming and challenging your interpretation. And finally, and this is on an institutional, the focus that you brought to bear on the role of the managing director. So, I mean, having been at the fund for so long, I mean, it's a strange institution because it needs to have a degree of political legitimacy, which it gets through the board. But it also has to have a degree of kind of intellectual credibility to convince markets, which it gets through, the economists who work there. And often those two dimensions, they're not often, but sometimes they're out of sync. And it is the managing director that basically intermediates the two. And often there's a lot of political pressure brought to bear for the fund to do something. And it's, the best managing director, and Jacques de la Rosière was among the best, can push back and say, actually, the staff have got a point here. And even though you don't see it right now, in the long term, we need to do this institutionally. And I think this was important. The area that I want to focus on, and I know it's not a topic of the book, but I couldn't help myself, is what's different now in terms of the technology. So the technology was developed during the 1980s debt crisis, and it was, as one of my colleagues has pointed out, was foundational. The lending into arrears policy, the standby arrangement, all of this was developed. But the technology has evolved, and the technology has evolved because the system has evolved. And what I found interesting when I was reading the book is what's the same and what's different. So let me identify a couple of points. Jérôme, one of the things that you point out is this concept of coercion, how the IMF played a coercive role with private creditors. And the criterion of coercion that existed in the 1980s was a criterion largely based on access limits. In other words, When Jacques Delosier sent that telex to the Bank Advisory Committee, he basically said there's a financing gap of 5 billion. Why was there a gap? Because the IMF was not going to provide any more money than was normally required as a matter of access limits, as a percentage of Mexico's quota. And that's what triggered the need for both the rescheduling and the concerted financing. So what do we have now? The criterion of coercion is certainly not access limits. The IMF has an exceptional access policy that allows it to lend multiple percentages of quotas, thousands % of quota. And it will do so largely to avoid a debt restructuring because of the concern about both the impact of the restructuring in the domestic economy, but also because of contagion. It doesn't mean that the IMF doesn't have a criterion for coercion right now. It does, but it's a different one. And it's the criterion of sustainability. So let's look at those two different criteria. All right. And this was a big debate in the early 2000s. There were some who said, we need to return to the criterion of access. And there were those who basically said, no, sustainability is a much better one, which gets to Anna's point about how do you distinguish between liquidity and insolvency. So the idea is the sustainability criterion supporters, you lend unlimited amount of financing beyond access limits unless and until the debt is unsustainable, at which point there has to be a debt restructuring, right? That's the criterion. So a question, if we had the debt sustainability analysis tool that we have now, which was developed because we use this criterion, and let's imagine that we had it in 1982. Let's imagine we had the MAC, the market access debt sustainability framework in 1982, and Mexico came along. Would we have said debt is unsustainable, there has to be a debt reduction? Intellectually, I'd like to hear what your response is, Jérôme. Intellectually, I think the answer is it's probably unsustainable. What would have happened? There would not have been a debt restructuring. Why? Because a debt restructuring would have brought down the US banking system. So the analog to this is, of course, what happened in the Eurozone crisis with Greece, where basically there was a sense that the debt of Greece was unsustainable. And the fund nevertheless said, but we can't do that because of the impact that it's going to have. And therefore, there was a delay. Similar thing. And that's why when I was reading your book, I was thinking about my own experience in the Eurozone crisis. So the point that I kind of want to make, and I think this is relevant right now, which is why your book is so timely. The Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF is reviewing the exceptional access policy of the IMF. And the central issue is this the right criterion? The sustainability criterion? Because at the end of the day, even if all of the sustainability lights are flashing red, politically, it may not be feasible to have a debt restructuring. And that puts the fund in a real bind. And maybe, I'm not saying that this is the case, there is some merit of having an access criterion where you no longer make the coercion based on a distinction between liquidity and solvency. You basically just trigger some form of burden sharing based on limits on IMF financing. This is something that actually was proposed in the early 2000s by the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. So I think this is, when I read your book, I was thinking about that. So the second thing I want to say is, of course, what's really different, Jérôme, now relative to before is creditor composition. And you might be surprised, I'm not talking about the fact that we've moved from banks to bondholders. What I'm talking about is One of the things that was really easy in the 1980s was official bilateral creditors. That was really straightforward. They came in, the Paris Club and the Agreed Minute, they were there and they were working lockstep with the fund at the beginning of the program. And that really continued through the 90s. We're in a different world now. And the collective action problems that we spent so much time in the 90s focusing on, which are collective active, and we introduced important reforms, the market, the collective action clauses. That collective action problem in some respects has now been superseded by collective action problems amongst official bilateral creditors. And that's the new challenge. But it raises the same issue, which is, and in fact, it's even more acute because, as you pointed out in the book, we were able to address collective action problems amongst private creditors relatively early on. We're not, I mean, by the end of the crisis, with the lending into arrears policy. If, we just basically said, if we can't get private creditors on board, we're just going to basically have a program in any event. And essentially the financing will be provided by the accumulation of arrears. This is very difficult to do when your creditors are the fund's shareholders. So in some respects, the collective action problem amongst official bilateral creditors raises an even more existential crisis for the fund. So with that, thank you very much for the book.
Thank you, Sean. Wow. So we are running. We're running a little bit late, but that's but the discussion was great. So I'll give you 3 minutes, if you want to quickly react to Sean and Anna, and then we take questions and you'll have more.
Well, 3 minutes for a very difficult question. That's how you pick up the easier one. Well, I think this issue of was the debt sustainable in 1982? No veteran from the crisis told me we should have done it. Even Ortiz was one of the lead negotiators on the Mexican side. He told me, well, nobody pretended in 1982 we needed the write-off. 85, 86, things changed. So I think what would be just great if the IMF were just using its kind of elementary, most simple debt assessment model and look back in a kind of forensic manner. That would be highly interesting to look at. Yeah, then you have this question of liquidity, which is not simple as a former professor of mine told me. Yes, liquidity has a place in economic theory comparable to the Holy Trinity in Catholic theology. The problem at the end being that it's endogenous, self-fulfilling. So at that point, if the criteria is so volatile, it's indeed quite hard. So I don't have an answer. I apologize on that one. But if you look back at the history of domestic private bankruptcy, it tells you that from the beginning, bankruptcy were quite hard, implicitly based on the notion that you are insolvent, we know it. So there was a cutoff date, every contract was more or less suspended, you open the correspondence, you possibly send a guy in prison. And then gradually when businesses became bigger with more complex capital accounts over the 19th century, people started to think, oh, it's highly disruptive. In fact, the process is destroying the animal. So we know, in fact, that it's not clear the signal of whether to get into bankruptcy or not is not that simple, because, of course, this credit system is already quite illegal, dangerous, unstable. But then gradually the discussion will move on and say, okay, we have this hard bankruptcy procedure, but it would be good if we can move upstream. If we could have some kind of signal, if we could have some kind of free bankruptcy system where collective action would be made easier and we could limit the cost of the restructuring. I think we are still there. I mean, Chapter 11 is very much about that.
prepackaged, so-called prepackaged bankruptcies about this. So the dilemma is still here, and I see it at the fund, always telling the country, come with us, we'll be kinder with you. Don't wait for the last moment. But then you have a conflict of incentive, because of course, for a government going to the fund is a shameful, you lose the next election, of course. So that's the point in 2 minutes.
So let's see if there are a few questions. And so Mark has one. Any other question? Dale and Yolanda. So okay, let's take the first four. Mark, Dale, Yolanda. I don't know your name. You'll tell me. And okay.
I'll just make a few comments quickly. Before the Brady plan, of course, Mexico did an exchange offer with JP Morgan, which was in fact a precursor of the Brady plan. It didn't have the same collateral features. It didn't have interest collateral, but they offered to exchange bank lending for new bonds. It was not very successful. The discount was very small. I think we probably wouldn't have done it at all, but there was a lot of pressure from JP Morgan to get it done. So there was the Brady plan actually built in part on that transaction. Secondly, one reason the banks were willing, indeed, almost eager to lend some of the new money that was part of the first 2 or 3 restructurings that Mexico did was it was used to pay interest, because Mexico never officially defaulted. They were always current, but they used bank money to pay it. And that was in the bank's interest because they didn't have to show it as a non-performing loan. Secondly, I think we should be careful, thirdly, about talking about the credit enhancement features of Brady bonds in the context of what people mean when they trade credit enhancement now. What we're looking at in terms of credit enhancement, climate finance and the like is completely different. In the Brady bonds, the interest collateral was Mexico's money. They took money and they put it in an account in the Fed. The principal collateral was borrowed by Mexico from the World Bank, from the Japanese, from various sources. So it was a loan. It was not a guarantee by any sort of stretch of the imagination. And the principal was a very odd guarantee, because what Mexico did was they bought interest strips from the United States Treasury, actually negotiated with them. And the only time you could touch the collateral was 30 years later at the end. So it was valueless until then. If there were a default in year 1, 2, 3, 10, or 15, you had a claim, but you couldn't go against anything. The collateral was only there to be used at the very end. So it's very different from credit enhancement today. And when people say, "Oh, let's do a Brady bond today," they don't understand what they're really asking for. But I would just point out in the case of Greece, Sean, the IMF put up almost no money, comparatively speaking. Hundreds of millions were put up by the ESM. Right now, Greece is paying no interest and no principal on that money. And I think everybody in that process recognized that there was no way that Greece should survive, there's no way you could call that a liquidity problem. And the bank, indeed, initially the government supported it, but there was a lot of lending to Greece in the outset. That's because to protect the European banks. So instead of having the banks take the hit and the European countries then taking their own resources to fund the banks or to keep the banks solvent, do it all through the European stability mechanism.
Let's try to do quick questions.
Sure. I spend a lot of my days looking at Chinese lending to developing countries that aid data, and I can't help but think about Anna's points, about how everybody said that, they knew it was insolvency from the start, and thinking about the Chinese financial system and evergreening and everything of this sort, and how what sort of parallels that has here in terms of thinking about resolution of debt. So would love to hear any thoughts that you have on that. Yeah.
My name is Elia Zhang. I'm with University of Pittsburgh. And so I have a question about the potential role of Japan as a new creditor in the 1980s. Because we know that after 1985, the Plaza Accord, the Japanese yen essentially appreciated 100% overnight against, American dollar. So then the Japanese started this Buying America campaign. They bought the Columbia Picture, they bought the Rockefeller Center, and meanwhile, they also started this global lending spree. So my question is, during the debt crisis, during the process of debt structuring, restructuring, will the Japanese, like the tooth fairy, as Anna say, did they come as the white knight in this scenario, or they essentially stay away from the scene?
Back to Yolanda and then Rosa still have a question.
Thank you. Yolanda Fresnillo from Eurodat, European Network on Debt and Development. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to reading the book, and thanks for the presentation. And you said at the beginning this was a little bit Western focused, but Anna also talked about the role of the debtors agency, and I was wondering if you could, I don't know, say something about it. I don't know if it's in the book or. So from the presentation, it all seems everything was happening in the US and there was no role by the borrowers, and knowing about also history in those days, it's hard to understand how that happened, and if there was no pressure and no credible threat of just not paying at some point, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, just very first to congratulate you on the book, and just a couple of points. One is comments and to get your feedback. One is you said that there is a limited amount of sources, bibliographical sources on the debt crisis. A couple of them that came to mind. One was, and I'm particularly interested about how you treat the relationship with the banking system, because I think that was very, very important, and prudential regulation and a lot of what happened, both particularly after. Karen Lisakers in Banks, Borrowers and Establishment, the book that she wrote in Lisakers, yeah. She talked about how the rise in non-performing loans was a major motivation for the US authorities to actually postpone and delay into the future. And the quote that you have there of Citibank is very relevant in that regard. They needed to recapitalize the banking system and to create sufficient non-performing loans. And the other is the incentives of overborrowing and overlending. And again, there is very little during the period in which this happened. But Arminio Fraga, he had a book, an article that he published in the Princeton Essays, in which he compared the German war reparations and Brazilian debt. And it's very telling because it's 1986. And he was already announcing that this is overborrowing and this is overlending. So just more a comment on it.
So very good. So we have 11 minutes. So we're going to give 9 minutes to Jérôme, 1 minute to Anna, and 1 minute to Sean.
Yeah, question by Mark Walker. Yeah, there was this Aztec, I think it was the name of the Mexican program, where in fact, if I understood, the banks wanted stronger enhancement. They wanted to have a longer time or feel more secure, if I understood correctly. Yes, and then of course, yes, all these things about new money loans was indeed some kind of hidden interest capitalization. Send the money, get it back. The point is then it's not appears vis-a-vis the regulator as a default or a problem. So that was truly a short-term perspective. And of course, the banks were told, oh, never, ever a write-off, including on the new money loans. But then 1989, new money loans were written off, which obviously made things difficult for the Reagan administration. Yes, credit enhancement, I agree with you. The Mexican got something, I don't remember the exact figure, like the 35% write-off, but then they had to give back immediately something like 15 or 17% back as some kind of enhancement, and they got it only when they withdrew the Brady bond some years later. So at a point when the opportunity benefit of it were much more limited. So I agree fully on that. Yes, generally on China, on which I'm not at all a specialist, I think indeed what you have, the parallel is indeed that putting good money on bad money may make sense up to a point. And that might well be what is happening in China today, although you hopefully then resolve the problem. Because if then you end up in a kind of 1985 dead end, of course, the dead end is much more darker than necessary. Yeah, debtor agency. I think it's what's curious looking at that dimension is how hard northern countries were. I didn't find, I write it, a single reference to just one seminar where debt negotiator from debtor country could meet together, exchange ideas, share experiences. That's not possible. I think that was, artists told me that they had at a point, they met Philippines negotiating team moving out of the fund, proposed to have lunch together, but that was some kind of catastrophe. That was a scandal. So you have the tough hand at that point, which is quite spectacular. At the same time, you very much see what I teach to my students, that the world is unfair. The market can be very damaging to you, but what is essential for those countries, for the country, developing emerging country, is your own skills, your elites, your public administration, your capacity to negotiate with the IMF. I mean, if you got hyperinflation plus a debt crisis, plus a catastrophe on your banks, it's not easy to address that. And generally, those countries have not had that experience before. So the IMF guys arrive, they have very precise idea, they have a records for years and years. So if you don't have minimal understanding of what's going on, if you don't have the data, of course it's copy-paste. And at that point, it's not just by chance that I have two Mexicans, because very clearly during all those years, Mexico was the country that was a trendsetter, where you have most continuity. Those guys were at the top of the files negotiating from 82 to 89. Whereas if you look at Argentina and Brazil, you had a continuous rollover because you had democratic transition, the system was not stabilized, so you had the Minister of Finance being there 18 months, then resigning, then you had an election. And it's not a judgment on the persons, but agencies also there. At the end, agencies, who is meeting the IMF guy? How much can they challenge that? How much can they come in and say, here's the program. We don't start from your one. It's the one we here in Brazil, we prepared. And I think the Brazilians are quite insistent on saying every IMF program will discuss on our own term, because they have a strong technocracy. So that dimension is quite important. The last point is 1989. I think from the US perspective, the Brady Plan was also a geopolitical moment. The Berlin Wall was falling. You had Poland, Hungary, and so on, moving to a capitalist model, to Europe, and so on. You could not let Latin America drift, either to far right or to far left government, as was the perception. So that dimension is not exactly agency, but a broader perspective than just a narrow balance sheet. What else? Oh, Japan. Well, Japan, as we know, in the 1980s was frightening everybody in the world, being the kind of new dominant country. The US was completely saying, well, that's nice. Japan was not very present. You don't see a lot of intervention. They were quite active at the end. They were also one of the forefathers of the Brady. There was a kind of Minister of Finance proposed something 6 months, 1 year before, which looked a bit like that. Otherwise, but it's more broader than Japan. As I said, Britain was very strong at the beginning. They even had a kind of unique report at the Bank of England, 1980 or something, on what would be the consequence of major sovereign defaults. 2 years before the crisis. And they pushed it at the BIS. And they explored the details of things. And then Larosière is quite keen to underline how the Bank of England was very supportive during the Mexican episode. But then they withdrew. The French were out. Mitterrand government were not interested. So if you ask Larosière, he becomes very angry about the support he received from his own country. Otherwise, it was essentially a US, IMF, US Treasury, Fed thing. Very limited policy impact by the others, I would say.
Very good. So we have 4 minutes. So maybe we start with Sean and then Anna. Just maybe one thing when you were talking, Jérôme, about the coordination of creditor, I went to dig out the famous CIA document about the Cartagena group, in which they say, we believe that the Cartagena group of 11 Latin American debtors will work to keep alive, they blah, 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 but they will not agree to anything. That's pretty much the.
Yeah, I asked Larosière about what was the impact of the Cartagena jargon and said, just not on the record.
Okay.
Did not care, not heard about. So
Just 2 quick points. So in defense of Jérôme's book, in response to the question about debtor agency, there is a really good chapter in your book about economic policy of these countries and how there was a transformation from rather, protectionist state intervention policies eventually towards, let's call it the Washington Consensus. And of course, that raises an interesting issue now as well, which is to what extent are we moving away from that consensus? But that's also part of the story. And the first period, and I think you do this well in the book, the first period was one of just looking at macroeconomic stabilization, right? Looking at prices, monetary policy, exchange rate policy. Baker realized that this was not going to be adequate. You needed to create balance of payments, transformation through structural policies, through growth. That didn't appear as well. But I think that there is a discussion in the book on domestic economic policy. And the point that I want to make just in response to Mark's point, the only point that I'm making is that if you had had a debt sustainability framework in 1982, even if the staff had concluded the debt was unsustainable, I think there would have been tremendous pressure not to have a debt restructuring because of the impact on the US banking system. In the Eurozone crisis with Greece, we had the same issue. In other words, essentially, Greece was basically an exceptional access territory. We had a debt sustainability framework in place, a policy, and we couldn't apply it for the same reason, which is even though it was probably in Greece's interest to do a debt restructuring earlier rather than later, it was not in the interest of the Eurozone because of the impact on the banking system. And that's the limited analogy that I'm making.
Right. So I want to pick up on the debtor agency point and then the institutional transformation point. This is not a book about debtor agency, but what was striking to me was precisely the sort of differences among different country approaches that you saw. And I think we should distinguish that from kind of the Washington Consensus point, right? Because there are lots of treatments of the Washington, the Nairi Woods book, right? There's sort of the Washington Consensus story as, you get a bunch of Chicago trained economists into Mexico, Colombia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get, similar policies. Everybody agrees. You get IMF programs. You live happily ever after, rinse, repeat. But I think that what this book is really good at is kind of fleshing out where countries saw their bargaining leverage. So for example, yes, 1989 was a huge geopolitical moment for the US, right? But if you have a government in Latin America that recognizes that like a change in Poland changes your bargaining leverage vis-a-vis the US Treasury, that's really valuable, right? And sort of, I don't know if you want to describe it as kind of know thy counterparty, whatever, but there is a lot of kind of rich stuff there. And then on institutional transformation, I think this came up in both Sean's and Mark's remarks and some of the questions. The IMF today, right, well, I mean, I want to say I don't have any authority to say that it's a, completely different institution, but just the extent of the transformation is fascinating. And it does make me wonder about the cost of going about institution building in that way, right? So is it inevitable that sort of we keep having kind of more and more bespoke policies with bespoke exceptions and bespoke exceptions to the exceptions, which is costly in and of itself in terms of accountability and kind of public intelligibility? On the other hand, what's the alternative? Ditch the IMF and try to form another institutional, arrangement, the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable and Common Framework say hello. This is not an overnight project, and it's not clear to me that an outcome is going to be, pristinely accountable and intelligible. So thank you. So much to learn.
Thank you. Thanks, Jérôme, for a fantastic book. And thanks to Anna and Sean for great comments. And thanks to everybody. I think we go to the lunch break.
Okay.